The small city of Winsterville was buzzing with its usual evening rush as people hurried home from work or gathered in local diners for a meal. Among the steady stream of traffic on Main Street, a sleek black Ford Mustang cruised past, its windows down to let the warm summer breeze flow in. Behind the wheel was Matthew Kane, a man in his early 40s with a sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes, and a MAGA hat perched proudly on his head. The hat was as much a statement as it was a shield, a symbol of his beliefs, which he wore openly despite the divisive reactions it often elicited. Matthew pulled into a parking lot outside a local convenience store. His military background gave him an air of authority, though he preferred to keep his past close to his chest. He stepped out of the car, adjusted his hat, and walked into the store to grab a bottle of water. Inside, a few patrons glanced at him, their gazes lingering on the hat. He had gotten used to the looks by now, some disapproving, some curious, and occasionally, a friendly nod from a fellow supporter. As he stood in line to pay, a pair of uniformed police officers entered the store, their presence commanding immediate attention. Officer Dwayne Richards, a towering man with a smug grin, strolled in alongside his partner, Officer Paul Hensley. Both men carried an air of arrogance that seemed to hang around them like a bad odor. Matthew noticed them immediately but kept his focus on the cashier as he handed over his payment. The officers, however, had already spotted him. "Hey, look at this guy," Richard said, nudging Hensley as he gestured towards Matthew's hat. "Walking around like he owns the place." Hensley chuckled, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think he's here to campaign or just showing off?" Matthew ignored them, his jaw tightening as he grabbed his water and walked out of the store. He'd dealt with enough jeers and comments in the past to know that engaging would only escalate the situation. But as he approached his car, he noticed the officers had followed him out. Richards leaned against the squad car, a smirk plastered on his face. "Hey, buddy," he called out. "What's the story with the hat? Trying to start a political rally or something?" Matthew turned to face them, his expression calm but firm. "Just a hat," he said. "It's a free country, last I checked." Hensley laughed, the sound grating and mean. "Yeah, free enough for you to drive around in this fancy car while wearing that thing. You sure you're not compensating for something?" Matthew didn't flinch. "You guys have a nice night," he said simply, unlocking his car and sliding into the driver's seat. But as he started the engine, Richards and Hensley exchanged a look. Richards stepped forward, tapping on the hood of the Mustang with his knuckles. "Nice car," he said. "Be a shame if something happened to it." Matthew's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching the officer's smug grin. He revved the engine lightly and pulled out of the lot without a word, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. He'd encountered plenty of people who didn't like his hat, but something about these two officers set him on edge. What Matthew didn't know was that Richards and Hensley weren't just going to let it go. As he drove off, they followed him at a distance, their squad car blending into the flow of traffic. Matthew noticed them in his mirrors but dismissed the thought. It wasn't illegal to drive with a political hat on, after all. He turned onto a quieter street, heading towards his home on the outskirts of town. The road was lined with trees, their branches casting long shadows in the fading light. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease as the city noise faded behind him. But just as he rounded a bend, the squad car's lights flashed behind him. Matthew pulled over, his heart sinking as he wondered what they wanted now. He rolled down his window and waited, his hands resting on the steering wheel. Richards approached first, his hand resting casually on the holster at his hip. "License and registration," Richards demanded, his tone sharp. Matthew handed over his documents without argument. "Is there a problem, officer?" Richards glanced at the papers before smirking. "No problem, just checking things out." "Nice car you've got here. You a collector?" "No," Matthew replied evenly. "Just something I saved up for." Richards nodded slowly, then leaned closer. You sure about that? Because a guy like you, driving something like this, makes people wonder. Matthew's patience was wearing thin. I'm not sure what you're implying, officer. Am I free to go? Richard straightened, handing back the documents with an exaggerated flourish. Sure thing, Mr. Kane. Drive safe now. Matthew watched in his mirrors as the officers returned to their car, still wearing those infuriating smirks. He drove off, his mind racing with irritation and suspicion. Something about this didn't feel right, but he pushed the thought aside. He was almost home. But trouble wasn't done with Matthew Kane. Later that night, as he sat on his porch sipping a cold beer, the sound of sirens in the distance caught his attention. He glanced down the road, expecting to see an ambulance or fire truck speeding past. Instead, the glow of orange flames lit up the sky. His heart sank as he realized the fire was coming from his driveway. He bolted down the steps, his beer forgotten, as the acrid smell of burning rubber and metal filled the air. His Mustang was engulfed in flames, the fire crackling and roaring with terrifying intensity. Neighbors began to gather, their voices a mix of shock and concern, but Matthew's focus was on the squad car parked just down the street, its occupants watching with thinly veiled amusement. Richards and Hensley didn't even try to hide their grins as Matthew approached, his fists clenched and his face a mask of controlled fury. What the hell is this? He demanded, his voice tight with anger. Richards shrugged, feigning innocence. Looks like someone doesn't like your hat. Matthew's eyes burned as he stared them down, his mind racing. He wanted to shout, to accuse them outright, but he knew better. Confronting them now wouldn't change anything, and it might only make things worse. Instead, he turned away, his heart pounding as he tried to formulate his next move. These cops had no idea who he was. But they were about to find out. The flames danced wildly against the night sky, consuming the sleek black Mustang that had once been Matthew's pride and joy. He stood motionless for a moment, the heat from the fire brushing against his face as he tried to steady his breathing. His neighbors murmured in hushed tones, unsure whether to approach or stay back. The crackling of the fire filled the tense silence, interrupted only by the faint, mocking laughter of Richards and Hensley as they leaned against their squad car, seemingly enjoying the show. Matthew clenched his fists, every fiber of his being screaming for him to retaliate. But years of military training and discipline held him back. He knew he had to think this through carefully. These officers had crossed a line, but rushing in without a plan would only give them the upper hand. He took a deep breath, then turned to his neighbors. Someone call the fire department, he said, his voice calm but firm. And please, stay back. It's not safe. An older man, Mr. Carver, nodded and shuffled off toward his house to make the call. Meanwhile, Matthew's mind raced as he surveyed the scene. This wasn't just an act of vandalism, it was a message. The kind of message that cowards like Richards and Hensley thought they could get away with. Richard sauntered over, his smirk widening as he met Matthew's steely gaze. Tough luck, Kane, he said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. Guess some folks don't appreciate your, political affiliations. Matthew said nothing, his eyes locked on the officer's face. He could see the arrogance, the smugness, and the utter lack of accountability in the man's expression. But he also saw something else, an overconfidence that bordered on recklessness. Richards didn't see him as a threat, and that was his first mistake. I'll let the fire department handle this, Matthew said evenly, his tone betraying none of the fury simmering beneath the surface. Thanks for sticking around. Richards chuckled, clearly taking the comment as a jab. No problem. Just doing our civic duty, you know. Wouldn't want anyone getting hurt. As the fire department arrived and began dousing the flames, Matthew stepped back, his hand still trembling with restrained anger. The once beautiful Mustang was now a smoldering wreck, its charred frame a stark reminder of just how far some people would go to make a point. But this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Once the fire was under control, Matthew spoke briefly with the firefighters and a curious young officer who had arrived to take a report. The officer, a fresh-faced recruit named Jensen, seemed genuinely concerned as he scribbled down the details. "Do you have any idea who might have done this, sir?" Jensen asked, his brow furrowed. Matthew glanced toward Richards and Hensley, who were now chatting casually by their squad car as if nothing had happened. "No," Matthew replied, keeping his voice neutral. "But I'm sure it'll come to light eventually." Jensen nodded, oblivious to the tension. "We'll look into it, Mr. Kane. Sorry this happened to you." Matthew thanked him and watched as the officers and firefighters cleared the scene. The neighbors slowly dispersed as well, offering their condolences and promises to keep an eye out for anything suspicious. By the time the street was quiet again, Matthew was left alone with the wreckage of his car and the smoldering anger in his chest. He walked into his house, his movements measured and deliberate, and locked the door behind him. In the dim light of his living room, he sat down at the small desk in the corner and opened his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he began typing, pulling up files and documents that had been stored away for this very moment. Matthew Kane wasn't just a random guy in a MAGA hat. He wasn't just a former military officer, either. What Richards and Hensley didn't know, and what would soon become their greatest regret, was that Matthew was the newly appointed chief of police for Winsterville. His official start date was in 3 days, a fact that had been kept under wraps as he transitioned into his new role. It was meant to be a quiet introduction, but now it was personal. He spent the next few hours reviewing personnel files, including the records of Richards and Hensley. Their names weren't new to him. Both officers had a history of complaints, excessive force, unprofessional conduct, and, most tellingly, a pattern of targeting individuals who didn't fit their narrow worldview. Yet, like so many others, they had managed to skate by, their actions overlooked by a system that rarely held officers accountable. Matthew's jaw tightened as he read through the reports. This wasn't just about his car or his hat anymore. It was about a culture of arrogance and impunity that had festered within the department he was about to lead. He wasn't just going to hold Richards and Hensley accountable, he was going to send a message that this kind of behavior would no longer be tolerated. The next day, Matthew made a few discreet phone calls, reaching out to trusted contacts within the city government and the department. He laid the groundwork for what was to come, ensuring that every step he took would be backed by the proper channels. He also made arrangements for his formal introduction as chief to be moved up. There was no time to waste. Meanwhile, Richards and Hensley remained oblivious to the storm brewing around them. They spent their shift patrolling the streets, swapping jokes about the MAGA guy, and congratulating themselves on a job well done. To them, Matthew Kane was just another target, another victim of their petty power games. But as the hours passed, small cracks began to form in their confidence. A few colleagues gave them odd looks, and there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere at the precinct. Whispers circulated among the staff, rumors of changes on the horizon and a new chief who wasn't afraid to clean house. Richards brushed it off, but Hensley couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Relax," Richards said as they sat in their squad car that evening, parked on a quiet street. "Nobody's gonna touch us. We've been here too long, and we know too much." "They wouldn't dare." Hensley nodded, though his unease lingered. "Yeah, you're probably right." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shades of orange and purple, the two officers had no idea that their days of unchecked power were coming to an end. And Matthew Kane, sitting in his darkened living room, was preparing to deliver a reckoning they would never forget. The quiet streets of Winsterville gave no indication of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Matthew Kane spent the next day working meticulously behind the scenes, orchestrating his plan with the precision of a tactician. His connections within the city's administration were proving invaluable. He reached out to the mayor, who had personally lobbied for his appointment as police chief, and briefed her on the situation. Mayor Linda Greer, a pragmatic leader with no tolerance for corruption, gave Matthew her full support. "They've embarrassed this department enough," she said during their phone call. "Do what you have to do, Chief Kane. I'll back you all the way." Hearing his new title addressed formally gave Matthew a momentary sense of pride, but he quickly refocused. The fight wasn't over yet. Richards and Hensley were still out there, strutting around the city like untouchable kings, unaware that their reign was about to crumble. That evening, Matthew visited a close ally within the department, Lieutenant Elena Brooks. She was one of the few officers he trusted implicitly, a seasoned professional who had spent years fighting against the same toxic culture that Richards and Hensley represented. "They think they're untouchable," Elena said after Matthew filled her in. "But they're not as clever as they believe. We've got enough complaints and evidence to at least bring them in for questioning. Are you sure you want to do this before your official introduction?" Matthew nodded. "If we wait, they'll have more time to cover their tracks or retaliate. We need to make it clear from the start that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." Elena agreed, and together they devised a plan to confront Richards and Hensley without tipping them off prematurely. They decided to involve internal affairs, ensuring that the investigation would have a solid foundation. The next step was gathering the final pieces of evidence, including witness statements and surveillance footage from the night of the car fire. By the time Matthew returned home, it was past midnight, and exhaustion was beginning to set in. But he couldn't afford to rest yet. He spent hours combing through additional reports and preparing for the day ahead. The wreckage of his Mustang still sat in his driveway, a grim reminder of why he was doing this. Every time he glanced at it, his resolve hardened. Meanwhile, Richards and Hensley were beginning to notice subtle shifts in the department. A few of their colleagues had started avoiding them, their usual camaraderie replaced by awkward silences and quick exits from shared spaces. Even their commanding officer, Captain Mills, seemed unusually reserved during their interactions. "Something's up," Hensley muttered as they sat in their squad car during a late-night patrol. "You think this has to do with the MAGA guy?" Richard scoffed, though his confidence wasn't as unshakable as it had been. "Nah, that guy's nobody. What's he gonna do, file a complaint? We've had those before, and nothing ever comes of them. Relax, man." But Hensley couldn't shake the unease creeping up his spine. It was as if the air around them had shifted, carrying a tension that was impossible to ignore. The next morning, as the department prepared for the day's briefing, the atmosphere was noticeably charged. Officers whispered among themselves, their eyes darting toward the doors every time someone walked in. Richards and Hensley entered the room with their usual swagger, but the subdued energy around them was hard to miss. "What's with everyone today?" Richards muttered under his breath. "You'd think they've seen a ghost." The answer came moments later when Matthew Kane walked into the room, accompanied by Mayor Greer and Lieutenant Brooks. Dressed in a crisp suit and exuding quiet authority, Matthew scanned the room before stepping to the front. The murmurs stopped immediately, replaced by a tense silence as every officer's eyes turned toward him. "Good morning," Matthew began, his voice steady and commanding. "My name is Matthew Kane, and as of today, I am your new chief of police." The room erupted into a mix of polite applause and stunned silence. Richards and Hensley exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado evaporating. Hensley leaned over to Richards, whispering, "Isn't that?" Richards cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. "No way. It's just a coincidence." Matthew continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I'm here to ensure that this department operates with integrity, professionalism, and respect for every member of our community. I'm also here to address a culture that, frankly, has been allowed to fester for far too long." His words hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Richards shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Matthew's eyes lingered on the two officers for a fraction of a second before moving on. "For those of you who are committed to upholding the values of this department, you have nothing to worry about," Matthew said. But for anyone who believes they're above the law or untouchable, well, let's just say those days are over. The room remained silent as Matthew concluded his speech and dismissed the officers to begin their shifts. Richards and Hensley left quickly, their earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of dread. "That guy's trouble," Hensley muttered as they climbed into their squad car. "What if he knows?" Richards waved him off, though his own anxiety was starting to show. "He doesn't know anything. Just keep your head down, and we'll ride this out." But their troubles were only beginning. That afternoon, Internal Affairs officially launched an investigation into the events of the previous night, interviewing witnesses and collecting evidence. Richards and Hensley were summoned for questioning, their cocky facades beginning to crack as the walls closed in around them. "You think he set this up?" Richards asked as they sat in the precinct's interrogation room, waiting for their turn to be called in. Hensley shook his head, his hands trembling slightly. "I don't know, man. But this isn't looking good." When Richards was finally called in, he tried to maintain his usual bravado, but the sharp, probing questions from the Internal Affairs officer quickly unraveled his composure. By the time Hensley's turn came, he was visibly sweating, his answers stumbling as he tried to deflect responsibility. Back in his office, Matthew monitored the proceedings with quiet satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place, and the reckoning was well underway. But this was only the beginning. Richards and Hensley had made their move, and now it was his turn to show them just how wrong they had been to underestimate him. For us to continue, comment below where you were watching from and like this story. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on stories. Richards and Hensley's world was beginning to unravel, though neither of them could quite admit it yet. After their interrogations with Internal Affairs, they returned to their patrol route, each man stewing silently in his thoughts. The silence in the car was oppressive, broken only by the crackle of the radio and the occasional muttered complaint from Richards. "IA's got nothing on us," Richards said eventually, as much to reassure himself as to convince Hensley. "It's just a fishing expedition." Hensley nodded, though his hands remained tight on the steering wheel. "Yeah, sure. They probably just want to cover their bases with the new guy. Make it look like they're doing something." Still, neither man could shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every glance from a fellow officer felt loaded with judgment, every passing conversation sounded like whispers about them. It wasn't paranoia, it was the beginning of their long-overdue reckoning. At the precinct, Matthew Kane was in full control, moving pieces on the chessboard with precision. The Internal Affairs investigation was proceeding smoothly, uncovering a treasure trove of misconduct in Richards and Hensley's files. Complaints that had been ignored or swept under the rug were now front and center, bolstered by new witness statements and corroborating evidence. It wasn't just the car fire that was coming back to haunt them, it was years of unchecked behavior. But Matthew wasn't content to rely solely on the official channels. He needed to send a message, not just to Richards and Hensley but to the entire department. The culture of corruption and impunity that they represented had to be rooted out, and that meant making an example of them in a way no one would forget. As the investigation progressed, Matthew began to receive quiet support from other officers within the department. Officers who had been too afraid to speak out before now saw an opportunity to make their voices heard. Elena Brooks, his trusted ally, served as a conduit for these officers, collecting their testimonies and ensuring they were included in the growing case against Richards and Hensley. "They're starting to panic," Elena reported one evening as she met with Matthew in his office. "Hensley's been asking around about who's been talking to IA. And Richards, well, he's still trying to act like nothing's wrong, but you can see the cracks." Matthew nodded, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Good. Let them squirm." The next day, Matthew decided it was time to turn up the pressure. He convened a department-wide meeting, calling every officer to the precinct's main conference room. The atmosphere was tense as officers filed in, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Richards and Hensley sat toward the back, their usual cocky demeanor replaced by wary glances at each other and the front of the room. Matthew stood at the podium, flanked by Elena and a representative from Internal Affairs. He waited until the room was completely silent before he began speaking. Over the past few days, I've had the opportunity to review the operations of this department, he began, his voice calm but authoritative. And while I've seen a lot of dedication and hard work from many of you, I've also seen behaviors and practices that have no place in this organization. He let the words hang in the air for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the room. Richards shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Hensley stared at the floor. Let me be clear, Matthew continued. This department will not tolerate corruption, misconduct, or abuse of power. Anyone who engages in these behaviors will be held accountable, no matter their rank or tenure. The murmurs started immediately, a low hum of tension that filled the room. Matthew waited for it to die down before he continued. To that end, I've initiated a review of all personnel files and complaints. Internal Affairs is conducting a thorough investigation, and I expect full cooperation from everyone in this room. Richards clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Hensley looked like he might be sick. Accountability isn't just a word, Matthew said, his voice firm. It's a commitment to the people we serve and to each other. And it starts now. With that, he dismissed the meeting, leaving the room abuzz with speculation and unease. Richards and Hensley left quickly, avoiding eye contact with their colleagues as they made their way back to their squad car. This is bad, Hensley muttered once they were inside. Really bad. Richards didn't respond immediately. He was staring out the window, his mind racing. We need to figure out who's behind this, he said finally. Someone's feeding IA. If we can shut that down, we might have a chance. But their attempts to control the situation only made things worse. The more they pushed, the more evidence surfaced against them. It wasn't just the car fire, dozens of incidents, big and small, were coming to light, painting a damning picture of two officers who had abused their power for far too long. Meanwhile, Matthew was preparing for the next phase of his plan. He had spent the past few days gathering support from the mayor and other key figures in the city's government, ensuring that his actions would have the backing they needed to stick. He also reached out to community leaders, building alliances and signaling that change was coming. The tipping point came when Internal Affairs presented their preliminary findings. The evidence against Richards and Hensley was overwhelming, including video footage of the car fire, witness statements from neighbors, and a long history of complaints that had been ignored or dismissed. It was enough to warrant immediate action, and Matthew wasted no time. The following morning, as Richards and Hensley arrived at the precinct, they were met by a pair of Internal Affairs officers waiting near the entrance. The two men were taken into custody on the spot, their protests drowned out by the murmurs and stares of their colleagues. Inside his office, Matthew watched the scene unfold on a security monitor, his expression unreadable. The precinct buzzed with energy as news of Richards and Hensley's arrest was just like wildfire, and there was still much to be done to repair the damage that Richards and Hensley had caused. Disbelief and quiet satisfaction. For years, Richards and Hensley had operated with impunity, their arrogance and misconduct casting a shadow over the department. Now, they were being held accountable, and the shift in atmosphere was palpable. Matthew Kane knew the significance of this moment. It wasn't just about removing two corrupt officers, it was about sending a message that the days of unchecked power and abuse were over. But he also knew that change wouldn't come easily. The culture that had allowed Richards and Hensley to thrive was deeply ingrained, and rooting it out would require persistence and courage. As Richards and Hensley were led to the holding cells, their anger and frustration boiled over. "This is a joke," Richards shouted, his voice echoing through the precinct. "You're all gonna regret this. Mark my words." Hensley, usually the quieter of the two, glared at the officers escorting him. "You think this is justice? We've done more for this city than any of you ever will." Their protests fell on deaf ears. The other officers watched in silence, some with grim satisfaction, others with a hint of unease. For all their flaws, Richards and Hensley had been part of the team, and their downfall served as a stark reminder of how quickly the tide could turn. Back in his office, Matthew met with Elena Brooks to discuss the next steps. The arrests were a victory, but they were just the beginning. "We've made a statement," Elena said, her tone cautious. "But this is where the real work starts. There are still people in this department who supported Richards and Hensley, whether out of loyalty or fear. They're not going to take this lying down." Matthew nodded. "I know. That's why we need to be thorough. Every complaint, every incident, they all need to be addressed. If there's anyone else involved in their activities, we'll find them." Elena leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "You've made a lot of enemies, Chief. Be careful." Matthew gave her a small smile. "I didn't take this job to make friends, Elena. I took it to make a difference." That evening, Matthew returned home to find his phone buzzing with messages. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers had reached out to commend him on his actions. But amidst the praise, there were also threats, anonymous messages warning him to back off or face the consequences. Matthew wasn't surprised. He knew that challenging the status quo would come with risks. But he also knew that backing down wasn't an option. The stakes were too high, not just for him, but for the entire community. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Internal Affairs continued their investigation, uncovering more evidence of misconduct within the department. Matthew held meetings with community leaders, listening to their concerns and assuring them that change was underway. He also began implementing new policies, emphasizing transparency, accountability, and respect. But as progress was being made, the backlash from Richards and Hensley's supporters grew. A small but vocal group of officers began pushing back against Matthew's reforms, accusing him of overstepping his authority and undermining morale. Rumors spread like wildfire, fueled by whispers of retaliation and sabotage. One night, as Matthew was leaving the precinct, he noticed a figure lurking near his car. His instincts kicked in immediately, and he approached cautiously, his hand hovering near his holstered weapon. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice steady. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a young officer named Officer Jenkins. Jenkins was one of the newer recruits, known for his eagerness and sense of justice. "Chief Kane," Jenkins said, his voice trembling slightly. I need to talk to you." Matthew relaxed slightly but remained alert. "What's on your mind, Jenkins?" Jenkins glanced around nervously, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I overheard something about Richards and Hensley. I think they're planning to fight back, even from inside. There's talk of people on the outside helping them. I didn't want to say anything in the station. You never know who's listening." Matthew's expression hardened. "Thank you for coming to me, Jenkins. What exactly did you hear?" Jenkins hesitated, then spoke in a rushed whisper. "They've got friends on the force, people who think you're the problem. They're saying you're trying to destroy the department, that you're making us look weak. And Richards, he's got connections. He's been bragging that he'll be out in no time." Matthew nodded, his mind racing. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. If Richards and Hensley had allies on the force, the situation was even more dangerous than he'd anticipated. "Stay vigilant, Jenkins," Matthew said. "And if you hear anything else, come to me directly. Your discretion is important." Jenkins nodded, his face a mix of determination and fear. "I will, Chief. I want to do the right thing." As Jenkins walked away, Matthew leaned against his car, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The battle for the department's soul was far from won, and the road ahead was fraught with challenges. But he wasn't about to give up. He had come this far, and he was determined to see it through. The next day, Matthew called an emergency meeting with Elena and a select group of trusted officers. They discussed Jenkins' warning and began strategizing how to root out any remaining corruption within the department. It was a delicate process, requiring careful planning and absolute discretion. At the same time, Matthew intensified his outreach to the community, working to rebuild trust and demonstrate that the department was committed to positive change. He attended town hall meetings, met with activists, and listened to the stories of those who had been harmed by the actions of officers like Richards and Hensley. The tension within the department continued to simmer, with divisions becoming more pronounced. Some officers rallied behind Matthew, inspired by his leadership and vision. Others remained loyal to Richards and Hensley, viewing them as scapegoats for a system that had long operated without accountability. As the days turned into weeks, the situation reached a boiling point. Threats against Matthew escalated, both from within the department and from outside forces. But amidst the chaos, he remained steadfast, knowing that the fight was far from over. Matthew Kane sat in his office late at night, staring at the growing pile of evidence against Richards and Hensley. It was almost surreal how deep their misconduct ran, years of abuse hidden behind the blue shield. His work was paying off, but the price was steep. The weight of constant threats, simmering division within the department, and the knowledge that powerful enemies were plotting against him hung heavy on his shoulders. The department itself was a cauldron of tension. Lines were drawn, with officers picking sides. The loyalists, still aligned with the disgraced officers, became more brazen in their defiance, while reform-minded officers stood firm in their support for Matthew. Every briefing room conversation felt like a battlefield, and every shift brought new challenges. Matthew knew he needed to act decisively. The moment called for a bold move, one that would tip the scales entirely in his favor. He decided to strike back against the corruption within the department not just through policy changes but by taking the fight to Richards and Hensley's network of loyalists. The opportunity came sooner than expected. One afternoon, Jenkins burst into Matthew's office, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "Chief, we've got a situation," he said, holding out a folder. "It's worse than we thought." Matthew took the folder and flipped through the pages. It contained intercepted communications and anonymous tips, revealing a conspiracy brewing among the loyalists. Richards and Hensley, even from their cells, were orchestrating a scheme to destabilize the department. There were plans for protests, leaks to the media, and even threats against key reformers. "This is coordinated," Matthew muttered, his jaw tightening. "They're trying to undermine everything we've worked for." Jenkins nodded. "And they're getting bolder. There's talk of using their connections on the street to stir up chaos, make it look like you're losing control." Matthew's mind raced. He couldn't let this escalate any further. If the loyalists succeeded, it would shatter the fragile progress he'd made and embolden the corrupt elements within the department. "Jenkins," Matthew said, his tone sharp and resolute, "assemble a team of officers we can trust, people who are committed to cleaning up this mess. We need to act now." Within hours, Matthew had gathered a small, trusted team in a secure conference room. Elena Brooks, of course, was by his side, along with Jenkins and a handful of other officers who had proven their loyalty to the cause. They reviewed the evidence and mapped out a plan to dismantle the loyalists' network. "We're going to treat this like an organized crime operation," Matthew said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "Surveillance, intelligence gathering, and strategic action. We need to cut them off at the knees." Elena leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "And what about Richards and Hensley? They're the masterminds behind this. We can't let them keep pulling strings from inside." Matthew nodded. "I'm working on that. But first, we need to neutralize their support on the outside." The team got to work, deploying covert surveillance teams and leveraging community connections to gather intel. It didn't take long to uncover the loyalists' plans. They were indeed using street-level contacts to incite unrest, hoping to create a smokescreen that would make Matthew look weak and incompetent. The first major clash came one night when a group of loyalists staged a spontaneous protest outside the precinct, accusing Matthew of being anti-police and jeopardizing public safety. The protest quickly escalated, with agitators throwing bottles and setting small fires. Matthew watched the chaos unfold from the precinct's command center. He could see the anger in the crowd, but he also recognized the orchestrated nature of the event. This wasn't a genuine protest, it was a power play. "Elena," he said, turning to his deputy, "get our community allies on the line. We need to counter this narrative before it spirals out of control." Elena nodded and began making calls, coordinating with local leaders to defuse the situation. At the same time, Matthew sent his trusted officers to engage with the protesters, emphasizing dialogue over force. The strategy worked, and within hours, the crowd began to disperse, leaving behind only a handful of die-hard agitators who were quickly arrested. But the victory was short-lived. The loyalists regrouped and began planning even more aggressive tactics. Matthew's team uncovered evidence of a planned break-in at the precinct, intended to sabotage critical files and undermine the ongoing investigations. The break-in was set for a Friday night, when the precinct would be at its quietest. Matthew decided to use the opportunity to send a message. He and his team set a trap, positioning themselves strategically around the building while monitoring the suspects through hidden cameras. When the loyalists made their move, they were met with overwhelming force. Matthew himself led the charge, storming into the evidence room where the intruders were attempting to access the files. "Freeze!" he shouted, his weapon drawn. The intruders hesitated, their faces masked but their panic evident. One of them made a move for the door, but Matthew was faster, pinning the suspect to the wall and disarming him in seconds. The other intruders surrendered without a fight, realizing they were outmatched. As the suspects were led away in handcuffs, Matthew felt a surge of satisfaction. It wasn't just about stopping the break-in, it was about proving that the department's new leadership wasn't afraid to stand up to corruption and chaos. But the victory came with consequences. The Loyalists' allies in the media spun the incident as an overreach, accusing Matthew of turning the department into a surveillance state. The backlash was swift, with critics demanding his resignation and questioning his tactics. Matthew faced the criticism head-on, holding a press conference to address the situation. He stood at the podium, flanked by Elena and Jenkins, his expression calm but resolute. "This department is committed to accountability and transparency," he said. "We will not tolerate actions that undermine our mission to serve and protect this community." The individuals involved in the recent break-in were acting against the law and against the principles of this department. The sun was setting over the city, accountable, casting long shadows across the precinct parking lot, but it paid off. Came prepared for what community leaders rallied behind of his career, praising his commitment to justice and his refusal to back down. Had reached a critical mass. Even some of his critics began to acknowledge the importance of his reforms and internal scrutiny. But the battle was far from over. Matthew sensed they had one final card to play. Behind bars, were still a last-ditch effort to reclaim their power and discredit him. As long as they had allies inside the outside, the atmosphere was tense, so it would continue. Elena Brooks stood by Matthew's uneasy calm, reviewing the latest intelligence for the final phase of his plan. Her sharp eyes scanned the loyalists were on the ropes, who had uncovered a chilling was yet to come. "Richards and Hensley are making their move," Elena said, her voice low but firm. "They've called in favors from some of their street connections, and word is they're planning a coordinated attack tonight. It's going to be big." Matthew nodded, his jaw tightening. "They're backed into a corner. Desperation makes people dangerous. We need to stay one step ahead." Jenkins, standing nearby, added, "They're targeting the precinct directly. Their people think they can storm in, destroy key evidence, and send a message. If we don't stop this, they'll spin it as a failure of leadership, and you know how quickly the media will pounce." Matthew leaned forward, his gaze steely. "Then we don't let it happen. We turn their attack into their undoing. Everyone who's involved goes down tonight, no exceptions. The plan was set in motion. Matthew's trusted team fortified the precinct, reinforcing key entry points and setting up discreet surveillance. Officers loyal to the cause were stationed strategically, ready to intercept the attackers at every turn. Meanwhile, community allies were quietly informed, ensuring that public support for Matthew's reforms remained strong. As night fell, the tension in the air was palpable. The Loyalists' allies began to gather in the shadows, their movements monitored by the precinct's hidden cameras. Richards and Hensley's plan was clear: overwhelm the precinct with a coordinated assault, seize the evidence, and create chaos that would tarnish Matthew's reputation. Matthew stood in the command center, watching the live feed from the surveillance cameras. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with determination. He had spent months fighting to restore integrity to the department, and he wasn't about to let it all unravel now. "They're moving," Jenkins reported, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "3 groups, front entrance, side alley, and rooftop. They're trying to hit us from multiple angles." Matthew nodded. "Let's give them a warm welcome." The first group of attackers approached the front entrance, their faces obscured by masks. They carried crowbars, bats, and makeshift shields, clearly prepared for a fight. But as they breached the outer doors, they were met with a wall of officers who quickly subdued them with precision and restraint. The second group, attempting to sneak in through the side alley, found themselves cornered by a squad led by Elena. Her sharp commands cut through the night as her team moved with practiced efficiency, disarming the attackers and securing the area. The third group, who had scaled the building in an attempt to breach the rooftop access, was intercepted by Matthew himself. He had positioned himself there deliberately, knowing that Richards and Hensley's most loyal followers would take the riskiest route. As the attackers reached the rooftop, Matthew stepped forward, his weapon drawn but his stance calm. "Drop your weapons," he commanded, his voice firm but steady. "This ends now." The attackers hesitated, clearly startled to see the chief of police standing in their path. One of them, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward, his hand hovering near a concealed weapon. "You think you've won?" the man sneered. "Richards and Hensley will walk, and you'll be nothing but a footnote." Matthew's gaze didn't waver. "You've already lost. Every step you've taken tonight has been recorded. Every person involved in this attack will face justice. It's over." The man's defiance faltered, and he glanced at his comrades, who were beginning to lower their weapons. Before he could make another move, officers emerged from the rooftop access, surrounding the group and securing their surrender. With the attackers in custody, the precinct erupted into action. Officers processed the arrests, documented the evidence, and ensured that every detail of the operation was airtight. Matthew returned to the command center, where Elena and Jenkins were reviewing the footage. "That was clean," Elena said, her tone both relieved and impressed. "They didn't stand a chance." Matthew allowed himself a small smile. "We've dismantled their network. Now it's time to take the final step." The following morning, Matthew held a press conference outside the precinct. Flanked by Elena, Jenkins, and a diverse group of community leaders, he addressed the city with a clear and confident voice. Last night, this department faced a coordinated attack by individuals determined to undermine justice and accountability. Thanks to the dedication and professionalism of our officers, we not only defended this precinct but demonstrated our commitment to the rule of law. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd of reporters and onlookers. "The actions of Richards and Hensley have cast a long shadow over this department. But let me be clear, their era is over. We are building a new legacy, one of transparency, respect, and service to our community. To those who continue to resist this change, know this: we will not back down." The crowd erupted in applause, and Matthew felt a surge of hope. The battle had been long and grueling, but the tide was turning. The precinct was no longer a bastion of corruption. It was becoming a symbol of resilience and renewal. Later that day, Matthew visited Richards and Hensley in their holding cells. The two men looked far less confident than they had weeks ago. The weight of their actions, and the consequences, was finally sinking in. "You thought you could burn down my car, mock me, and break this department," Matthew said, his voice calm but unyielding. "But all you did was expose yourselves for what you truly are. Your time is up." Richards glared at him but said nothing, while Hensley looked away, his bravado replaced by quiet defeat. Matthew turned and walked away, leaving them to face the justice they had so long evaded. As he stepped outside, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm light over the precinct. For the first time in months, Matthew felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges to face, but he knew that he had set the department on the right path. And as he adjusted the MAGA hat perched on his head, a small, defiant grin crossed his face. They had underestimated him, mocked him, and tried to destroy him. But in the end, he had stood his ground and emerged stronger than ever.